Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of Crit Hit Reviews with your host, Arlyeon. In today's episode, I'll be dealing the goods on Grey Alien Games Solitaire-styled RPG Shadowhand. Find out if I think this game made the cut, or if I didn't appreciate the hand I was dealt. So, Shadowhand tells the tale of Lady Cornelia Darkmoor, a young noble lady who's fast approaching their 21st birthday, therefore inheriting the rights to their estate. Unfortunately, coming-of-age festivities soon become the last thing on their mind, as they find themselves the unfortunate victim of a robbery. A crime which also results in the disappearance of their dear friend and the discovery of a grim conspiracy they can't help but become embroiled in. Striving to get to the bottom of this, Cornelia becomes the, I guess it'd be larcenous. Definitely larcenous Shadowhand. Because whilst being a vigilante is cool for solving crimes, ironically, or maybe unironically, becoming a highwayman and leaving a trail of dead lawmen, burglars, and IRS agents in your wake is woke as hell. Okay, so, well, that was sort of partly in jest. That's not actually that far from the actual state of things. Sure, a lot of people are totally malign, but you end up burying a lot of soldiers by the end of the game, and yes, there's totally revenue agents in there because, well, death and taxes just go hand in hand. Silliness aside, Shadowhand does have a rather large story component built into it, as every chapter does provide a fairly large amount of character dialogue to set the stage for the current scene, as well as building up the overall plot at large. Honestly, I didn't mind the narrative, even if things could be a little bit text-dense at times, or hammy. I mean, I actually found the latter rather endearing. But I was a bit disappointed that the game did tip off the vast majority of its plot by the midway point. This unfortunately ended up making the rest of the journey somewhat predictable for me on a narrative level, beyond just the bits of filler which would crop up to justify why I was being flung into a new segment of combat or puzzles. Honestly, while there is a fair amount of dialogue, the meat of Shadowhand is the gameplay. Effectively, it plays off as a rather curious version of Solitaire. Sort of Solitaire? Albeit with two distinct styles. Some of the game's trials play out akin to a puzzle, challenging you to clear the board, or at least clearing a path towards objectives, which lay scattered beneath the piles of cards in a limited number of moves, while also having to navigate some obstacles. The other portions are battles, which have you competitively clearing out stacks of cards against an opponent, with both of you alternating back and forth clearing the board, and trying to establish the longest possible combo chains manageable so you can soundly eviscerate your opposition before they do the same to you. That said, whilst the obstacles and the puzzle segments do exist here, they also influence NPCs so they can actually work to your benefit. Overall, the base of the game, which is to say grabbing cards which are numerically adjacent to the card in your deck, is fairly simple. It's just complicated by a number of facts. And I'm not talking the obstacles, because first off, the various stages are randomized, which means no true solution is present, and also means in turn, a board might not necessarily be completely solvable in the iteration you play, especially during the earlier junctures of the game. Whilst earlier difficulties do allow you to continue onwards through the puzzle segments without beating them, the hardest mode requires you to fulfill all of a given chapter's bonus objectives, which tend to reward clearing the board and as much perfect play as possible. It also limits the amount of gold you get, which isn't overly troublesome, since you'll likely end up with more than enough to acquire everything, but this makes some of the stage goals tied to acquiring lucre excessively hard to achieve, and which can in turn make clearing a chapter impossible if you haven't built up enough money over the course of it, obliging you to restart from the beginning. That was more or less the breaking point for me actually, where I switched from very hard down to normal. That's not to say it wasn't achievable, technically. There's in fact a leveling system in Shadowhand which could have contributed to making that particular aspect of the challenge easier. But whilst you gain levels, they aren't acquired by experience, but rather by progressing through the story. And therefore you have a limited amount of them that you can acquire and a limited amount of points to spend. Rather than trying to make Scrooge McDuck levels of loot, I decided I wanted to choose the abilities that would help minimize the amount of randomness that I encountered, or at least let me plan ahead for it. To that end, the game's equipment system also helps, because while most of the stuff you acquire is oriented towards better battling and battering your opposition, a few items actually provide boosts to those stats and therefore allow you to control the odds a bit more in your favor. Perhaps that's why I actually enjoyed the combat more than the puzzle segments. Sure, there was still the possibility of being at the mercy of RNG, this leading to moments where you're watching, breath held, as an NPC chains 15 cards together and then smashes your health for a crushing amount of damage, and then has the gall to stun you on top of that, and then beat you down some more on the subsequent turns. It happens. But it never quite felt as frustrating as the puzzle segments, as combat plays out until someone croaks, which led to some distinctly satisfying moments where I got to behold an NPC repeatedly crap draws while I was on my last breath, or just, likewise get foiled by obstacles. Especially since, unlike you, they don't have access to abilities that bend luck in their favor. Honestly, the biggest failing in the late game combat was just the fact that a number of enemies end up having rather monstrous amounts of health and damage resistance, ultimately leading combat to becoming drawn-out battles of attrition, especially given they have healing items which restore percentages of health. I do have to say though that as far as accessibility, there is a casual difficulty, which does make the various challenges and combat sections completely optional, and more or less converting Shadowhand into a visual novel with some optional card clicking. Not my cup of tea, but I imagine some people may appreciate that, especially if they want to see the story through. Thematically, I'd have to say that the music in Shadowhand does end up feeling fairly apropos to the overall setting and theme of the game. That said, whilst it was a pleasant soundtrack to have playing in the background, it didn't make a tremendously strong impact on me. On the visual side of things, Shadowhand's fairly nice, with the backgrounds and enemies being appealing to look at. And there's certainly a fair bit of fun to be had dressing up your main character with bits of gear and weapons, even if maximizing your abilities may end up with you wearing the equivalent of RPG rainbow pimp armor. I swear to God, I was stuck wearing a fake beard for ages before I found something better to take that equipment slot. Anyways, this brings us to the finale, so let's just dive in. Ultimately, I have to say, whilst I certainly didn't overly mind my time in Shadowhand, I can't say it was a flawless experience or one that I was overly enthusiastic about. Given the vastly random nature of the game, especially during its early junctures, a lot of encounters ended up feeling extremely RNG directed, and whilst playing on normal at least allowed me to bypass elements of the game without playing perfectly, the combat could end up feeling like a slog, or just brutally unfair at times. Honestly, despite the prodigious amounts of health and armor enemies had during the endgame, I honestly found the segment the most rewarding, if only because by that juncture, you have so many abilities, bits of gear, and passive and active skills which can be used to both minimize the RNG and give you a much needed edge in combat, though if you haven't mastered it, it's going to be a pain. Likewise, whilst the story wasn't terrible, I'll admit that the overall plot arc wasn't exactly compelling, as it rather frequently undoes any sort of dramatic tension it could be building up by preemptively showing its hand alongside an excess of filler serving to further dilute things. It didn't always lean on excuse plots for the various chapters, as I did enjoy some of the continued back and forth of dialogue, but some of them were extremely forgettable. Ultimately, the game ends up feeling like a bit of a fumble to me. Whilst I enjoy challenging games, there were countless moments where that sense of challenge wasn't from a well-crafted set of obstacles, but due to flukes or just unexpected turns of events. Victory in combat could just as swiftly come from well-applied pattern recognition and ability usage, as it could from the enemy going first or a series of moves unveiling a chain of cards you can't use, allowing them to unleash devastating stuns on you multiple times in a row. And not getting a turn for ages is a dreadful feeling, especially when you've managed to whittle an enemy down, if only for them to empty out your reserve of health in a few fateful turns. Still, perhaps it will resonate better with some of the card game enthusiasts in the audience. Just don't dive into very hard mode to start with, it is a doozy of a first step. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And for those interested in more indie reviews, developer interviews, podcasts, or our Monday TTRPG content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know when there's a new release. There's also a Discord. You can click the link in the banner or description so you can become part of our community, the Crit Hit Cauldron. Lastly, if you'd like to help support the channel, we do have a coffee running now to help supplement funds for a lovely editor and make sure we can provide quality content. Again, check the description plus banner for them links, and if there is enough request for Patreon, we will actually switch to using Patreon. But hey, I'll catch y'all on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks. Was simply the fact that, remember, the enemies ended up having some rather monstrous amounts of health and